Have you ever felt a really strong emotion?
Yeah.
Like something really significant for you and the person you're with completely misses the mark.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Like they see, frustration when you're actually completely overwhelmed, or they interpret your quietness as disinterest when you're actually processing a whole bunch of stuff
Mm-hmm.
internally. For some people, this kind of emotional misinterpretation isn't just an occasional awkward moment. It's a constant experience that has a really deep impact.
Yeah, and that actually gets to the heart of what we're going to be exploring today in this deep dive,
Right.
focusing on this really powerful piece by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks
Okay.
titled "They Call Me Bitter" on the mistranslation of autistic emotion. And it's this really personal reflection on what it's like to, experience overwhelm and all of the subtle nuances that can exist within emotions, and also the persistent experience of being fundamentally misread,
Yeah.
particularly through their perspective as an autistic and trans person.
And this piece, which you shared with us, really resonated. I think it's so honest. And it articulates something that can be really difficult to grasp if you haven't experienced it yourself.
Absolutely.
So our goal today is to really unpack why autistic emotions are so often misunderstood, and to really extract the key insights from Dr. Hoerricks' unique viewpoint and their incredibly vivid way of expressing these experiences.
I think you put that perfectly. At its core, Dr. Hoerricks' writing reveals this fundamental tension
Okay.
between their rich and complex inner world of emotions
Yeah.
and the external world's tendency to kind of simplify and flatten those feelings, often slapping on inaccurate and frankly negative labels. It's right there in the opening lines of the piece where they write, "My body says I'm overwhelmed." They hear, "I'm angry," I freeze. They see defiance, I stim. They call it disruption, I retreat. They write me off. So you can really see that disconnect
Yeah,
between what's happening internally for them and how it's being perceived by others.
absolutely. And so let's kind of dig into that opening a little bit with one of the most striking analogies that Dr. Hoerricks uses in the piece, and that is the house red analogy. So they use this to describe how their emotions were once perceived as this single, flat, and often negative experience, kind of like a very basic, unremarkable wine. But then something shifts for them with HRT. They describe suddenly having access to a list, a whole vocabulary for this incredible range of nuanced feelings.
What I think is so fascinating about that section is the very specific and evocative language that Dr. Hoerricks uses to illustrate this shift.
Yeah.
So instead of a general sadness, they could suddenly identify what they were feeling as damp forest floor sadness.
Wow.
And overwhelm wasn't just a bad feeling, it had these layers like deep garnet, shadowed with panic, green bell pepper bursts of urgency.
I love that.
I know, and I think the wine analogy is so powerful because it helps us understand the sheer level of detail and complexity that was always there for Dr. Hoerricks,
Right.
but they lacked the framework for recognizing and communicating those nuances. In the same way that we might struggle to identify all the different flavors in a complex wine if we don't have the vocabulary. And HRT acted as this catalyst. It provided a new way to perceive and articulate these internal states, not through someone else's words, but through their own precise language for their emotions.
And I think the importance of finding their own language
Yes.
can't be overstated.
Absolutely.
It wasn't about adopting someone else's emotional dictionary. It was about uncovering this deeply personal way to map their inner world, which takes us right to the issue of these misunderstood emotional landscapes
Okay.
that Dr. Hoerricks describes.
Yeah.
There's this societal tendency, particularly in more structured environments like schools and workplaces, to really focus on outward behaviors when interacting with autistic individuals,
Yeah.
often completely overlooking what's happening internally.
Right. And the piece gives really clear examples of this disconnect.
Okay.
For instance, quietness can be interpreted as disengagement, even when someone is internally processing a huge amount.
Yeah.
Stimming, which is often a way to self-regulate, is frequently seen as disruptive and something to be stopped. Meltdowns, which are usually a response to being completely overwhelmed by sensory input or emotions, are often misread as intentional tantrums.
Right.
Similarly, shutdowns, which are a coping mechanism for extreme overwhelm, can be viewed as defiance. And retreating to find calm can be seen as avoidance. You can just see how the external label
Yeah.
doesn't match the internal reality at all.
It's so true. And it's so important now that this isn't just Dr. Hoerricks' personal experience.
Exactly.
They bring in research that really backs up these lived experiences of misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, work by Fung et al. Highlights how behaviors like shutdowns and meltdowns are so often mistaken for misbehavior.
Yeah.
Simply because people focus on what they can see, not on the internal feeling of being overwhelmed. Essentially, autistic youth reported feeling like they were drowning, not acting out in anger.
Right. And building on that, the piece mentions Veerasami's research, which points to this interesting contradiction. Educators might say they value self-regulation,
Right.
but they often misinterpret how that looks in autistic students. Behaviors like stillness, silence, or even specific movements and sounds, which can actually be forms of self-regulation, are instead seen as problematic. Then there's research by De Groot and Van Straen showing that emotional dysregulation in autistic individuals is frequently misread as aggression, again focusing on the outward behavior and applying a negative interpretation without understanding the root cause.
Right.
And Nason's work further underscores this, showing how shutdown, which is often a way to protect oneself from further overwhelm, is wrongly perceived as apathy or a lack of caring.
And it's like these coping mechanisms, as Dr. Hoerricks describes them, the stimming, the quietness, those moments of withdrawal, which research like Garvey's and Clifford et al.'s identifies as acts of self-care, are the very things that are so often discouraged or even punished.
Yeah.
And the piece makes it clear that this constant misinterpretation has a real cost. It's not just about feeling misunderstood.
Right.
It can lead to significant distress, trauma, and a negative impact on mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Dr. Hoerricks beautifully shifts gears in the piece and starts to talk about their personal journey of developing this richer emotional vocabulary.
Okay.
And they do so through some, I think, unexpected avenues, like wine tasting and appreciating whiskey.
I love that section.
This part of the piece is so insightful, I think, because it shows how learning to identify subtle nuances in sensory experiences actually translated to a deeper understanding of their own internal emotional landscape.
I agree.
The way they describe that Chateauneuf du Pape is just incredible.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just red wine.
Right.
It's this layered experience with dark fruit, spice, earth, smoke, and warmth. And it's like this revelation that something could be so complex and still be considered good. That realization, so still be called good, feels so profound when you consider their experiences of often being negatively labeled.
I think what's so insightful about that is how this sensory exploration allowed Dr. Hoerricks to move beyond those simplistic kind of one-dimensional labels that had been put on them. It was about recognizing the different notes and complexities, even contradictions, within a single experience. And this ability to discern these subtleties in wine, I think, provided a framework for understanding the multifaceted nature of their own emotions. It's like moving away from that single house red understanding to recognizing the full spectrum of flavors that exist within their own internal world.
Absolutely. And then the Jura whiskey.
Oh, yes.
The contrast they draw between its elemental, defiant nature and the blunt force of other Islay whiskeys is so powerful. The distinction between being loud and being heard, spectacle and true resonance,
Right.
it really speaks to their longing to be understood for their depth rather than being, overwhelming or constantly misunderstood.
Absolutely. In their description, that Jura whiskey embodies a kind of inherent self-acceptance, not trying to be something it isn't. And that clearly resonated with their own journey. It wasn't about being the loudest or most outwardly expressive, but about being authentically themselves and being seen for who they truly are with all their inherent complexities.
And then the transition to HRT is described as this rendering, bringing this incredible clarity to feelings that were previously indistinct. It's like suddenly everything they had always felt came into sharp focus, and they could finally name, even taste these emotions and ultimately accept them.
Yeah.
The realization that they weren't too sensitive, but actually precise, and that it was the world around them that lacked the vocabulary to understand is such a crucial insight.
That is such a pivotal moment in their narrative, I think. The HRT didn't create new emotion, but it provided the clarity and the structure to finally understand and articulate what had always been there. It was about recognizing the inherent precision of their internal experience and the deep frustration that came from the external world's inability or unwillingness to acknowledge that precision.
And this constant misframing, as Dr. Hoerricks calls it, carries such a significant negative weight. It erodes that fundamental self-trust and leads to this feeling of being a problem that needs to be fixed rather than a complex human being whose story deserves to be heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of nuanced representation of autistic individuals in media only makes this worse.
You bring up such a crucial point about representation,
Yeah.
because when the common portrayals of autistic individuals are so limited and often negative or stereotypical, it reinforces these harmful misconceptions and makes it even harder for individuals to see themselves reflected accurately in the world around them. And this lack of representation, I think, contributes to that internal questioning that many autistic people face. Was I really being rude? Was that really too much? Am I fundamentally broken? These are the really damaging consequences of ongoing misinterpretation.
Absolutely. And ultimately, Dr. Hoerricks makes this really important call for change, emphasizing the need for slowness, curiosity, and listening as a direct alternative to this rush to misinterpretation. It's about actively choosing not to make assumptions, not to try and diagnose from a distance, and certainly not to force autistic expressions into these pre-labeled boxes that just don't fit.
And the emphasis on curiosity, I think, is so key. It's about approaching interactions with a genuine desire to understand someone's internal experience, rather than immediately applying preconceived notions or diagnostic labels based solely on what you observe externally. And the call for slowness acknowledges that autistic processing and expression might not always align with neurotypical expectations of speed and linearity. It requires patience and a real willingness to truly listen without judgment.
And I think the author's deliberate use of sensory language and metaphor throughout the piece is so powerful. It's a way to bridge that gap between the often nonlinear or nonverbal autistic inner experience and neurotypical understanding.
Absolutely.
It's a request for genuine attention, for that sipping and noticing, rather than a demand for immediate translation or a quick rush to categorize and label.
Exactly. The metaphors become a way to communicate the richness and complexity of their internal world in a way that resonates on a sensory level, inviting the reader to engage with the experience rather than just analyzing it intellectually. It's an invitation to slow down, to really take in the nuances, and to appreciate the depth that might be completely missed if we just gulp and label.
So the key takeaway here is really about recognizing that autistic individuals experience this incredibly rich and complex inner world, and that constantly misinterpreting their emotions have these really profound negative consequences on their sense of self and their overall well-being. There's a fundamental need for a shift towards genuine curiosity and active, non-judgmental listening.
I completely agree. And the author's journey, as they've shared it with us, is one of incredible resilience.
Yeah.
It's about learning to trust their own internal experience, to validate their own tasting notes, and to refuse to let others' limited interpretations define their inherent depth and complexity as a person.
Which brings us to those incredibly powerful final lines. They sip nothing and call me bitter. I learned to trust my own tongue, to trust the body that carries these flavors, to trust the life that brewed them, and I will not let their palate define my depth, not anymore. That's such a strong statement of self-acceptance and a refusal to be limited by others' misunderstandings.
It truly is. It perfectly encapsulates the entire journey of the piece, moving from a place of constantly being misread and mislabeled to one of profound self-awareness and self-acceptance. It's a powerful reminder of the vital importance of internal validation and the immense strength that comes from trusting your own lived experiences.
So for you, the listener, maybe take a moment to consider the times you might have quickly labeled someone's emotional response without really understanding what was going on internally for them. Think about how slowing down, practicing genuine curiosity, and truly listening without immediately trying to translate or categorize their experience could lead to more meaningful connections and a much deeper understanding in all of your interactions. Perhaps the unique flavors of others' emotions, even when they feel unfamiliar to us, actually hold valuable information if we are just willing to sip and notice.
I think that's a beautiful way to end this deep dive.
Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.